Hey everyone, this is Pete. Just a quick bit of disclosure before we kick off today. I am, at the time of recording, an employee of Blaze Entertainment, the makers of the product I'm talking about today. I've not been paid or asked to make this video by either Blaze or Atari. It's something I've done in my free time because I really like the product and want to celebrate it in my own way on my own channel. To put it another way, I'd probably be making this video even if I didn't work for Blaze. Thus, it hopefully goes without saying that all opinions expressed in this video are my own and are nothing to do with my employers or Atari. All good? Right then, let's begin. This is the HyperMegaTech Super Pocket Atari Edition, a low-cost handheld that includes 50 built-in games, plus full compatibility with Evercade cartridges. That means if you ever tire of those 50 built-in games, and why would you can expand the capabilities of the device with more than 500 officially licensed retro re-releases and modern indie titles, all with classic-style plastic clamshell cases and full-colour manuals. But that side of things is not what we're here to talk about today. As the name suggests, the Atari Edition Super Pocket's preloaded games are all from the Atari stable, running the gamut from Atari's earliest arcade games through its home releases for 2600, 5200, 7800 and Lynx, plus a few titles Atari nabbed in its acquisition of some Stern Electronics intellectual property in mid-2023. As you surely know by now if you spent any time with me here on this channel, I love me some Atari. So what we're going to do today is go through each and every one of those 50 games, talk about why they're worth spending some time with, and hopefully by the end you'll have a better idea of why this is one of my favourite products that I've had the good fortune to work on in my career. Note that as the Super Pocket is a handheld only device with no video output, all game footage in this video has been captured using emulation, so there may be some minor differences between how they appear here and how they look on the Super Pocket. Shouldn't be anything too drastic though. With all that out of the way, let's begin. Conceived by Lyle Rains, programmed by Ed Logg and released in November of 1979, Asteroids was a big hit for Atari in the arcades, and one of the first major hits in arcades generally. It came about as an evolution of several earlier titles, most notably 1971's Computer Space by Atari predecessor Syzygy Engineering, Atari's own Lunar Lander from earlier in 1979 which featured vector graphics, and Taito's astronomically popular 1978 hit Space Invaders. Asteroids sold an impressive number of arcade cabinets for the era, somewhere in the region of 56,000 cabinets to be precise, and did even better once it was ported to home systems. The Atari 2600 version alone sold over 3 million copies, a gigantic number for the early 80s, when the video gaming market was considerably smaller than it is today. Asteroids has enjoyed enduring popularity over the years thanks to its simple concept but challenging gameplay. It's a game you'll need to put in some practice to master, but it's incredibly rewarding once you get to grips with its distinctive turn and thrust handling. An essential Atari title from the golden age of arcades for sure. Berzerk was designed by Alan McNeil and released by Stern Electronics in 1980. The concept is simple. You are the humanoid, and your job is to survive as long as possible against the relentless onslaught of killer robots, who become more and more ferocious with each room you successfully escape. To further add to your woes, the robot's leader, a maniacally smiling face known as Evil Otto, frequently shows up and chases you, forcing you to decide between frantically cleaning up the last surviving enemies or leaving the room early, forever dooming yourself to be branded a chicken by your foes for the rest of your game. Berzerk was one of the first video games to feature speech synthesis, and unsettled many an arcade goer in the early 80s by bellowing out "Coin detected in pocket" as potential players passed by. Urban legend also has it that the original arcade machine actually killed a teenage player back in the early 80s, but it later transpired he had a pre-existing heart condition that just happened to bring his life to an unfortunate end while he was playing the game. Berzerk has a long legacy. Its multi-directional shooting mechanics directly inspired Eugene Jarvis to incorporate his revolutionary twin-stick control scheme for 1982's Robotron 2084, and its combination of maze exploration and fast action is regarded by some modern gaming historians as an unacknowledged influence on Silas Warner's 1981 classic Castle Wolfenstein, which in turn means that Berzerk can somewhat indirectly trace its lineage forward into modern first-person shooters. Canyon Bomber was a 1977 release by Atari, programmed by Wendy Allen. It's an extremely simple game that uses just one button. All you have to do is drop bombs into a canyon in an attempt to score as many points as possible before you run out of misses. This simplicity makes it a great handheld game, ideal for those times when you want to play something fun but don't want to have to concentrate too hard, like having a poo or enduring a particularly tedious conference call. You're marked with a miss if one of two things happens. Either your aircraft proceeds across the entire screen without dropping a bomb, or if your bomb you dropped fails to hit any of the rocks that fill the canyon. Scoring is determined by the numbers on the rocks, with the trickier to hit rocks around the edges of the canyon and across its base tending to be worth the most. A game of Canyon Bomber begins with you dropping bombs from a blimp. These are powerful and can offer an early opportunity to rack up the points. After a few flypasts, the blimps are replaced by biplanes, whose bombs don't blast quite as deeply into the rocks. At this point, you need to time your shots a little more carefully and focus on precision. All the while you play, you're competing against a computer-controlled opponent. They're not too much of a challenge though, so instead the best way to enjoy Canyon Bomber is to try and beat your previous scores. Crystal Castles was a 1983 release from Atari, developed by Franz Lanzinger, with artistic contributions from Barbara Singh and Susan McBride. It's historically noteworthy for being one of the first games to have warp zones, allowing players to quickly access later levels, plus an actual ending. Although, as anyone who has actually reached said ending will attest, it's a tad underwhelming by modern standards. Crystal Castles is a maze chase game that even Lanzinger himself admits takes a fair few cues from Namco's 1980 classic Pac-Man. Its main distinguishing feature is its quasi-3D play area. Presented using trimetric projection, Crystal Castle's mazes feature slopes, steps, elevators and solid 3D structures that protagonist Bentley Bear can move into, around and even behind. Not only that, but it features a variety of different level designs compared to Pac-Man's single 2D maze. Key to getting to grips with Crystal Castles is understanding the behaviour of its enemies. For example, it's helpful to know that if you run through the gem eater enemies while they're displaying their swallowing animation, you'll defeat them. Similarly, if you jump over the nasty tree enemies, you'll temporarily stun them. Using these tricks, you can outwit the enemies and take aim for the big bonuses on offer for being the one to nab the last gem on each stage. Frenzy is another Stern Electronics title, again developed by Alan McNeil. It's the sequel to Berzerk, and once again casts players in the role of the humanoid, and tasks them with surviving against increasingly ferocious onslaughts of robot enemies. There are a couple of differences this time around though. Firstly, the walls are no longer electrified. Instead, there are two types of wall. The dotted walls can be destroyed, allowing you to create new pathways to move or shoot through. The white walls, meanwhile, are reflective, allowing you and the enemies to ricochet shots around corners, and if you're not careful, right back into your own face. Another difference is that every few rooms you'll encounter a special feature that adds its own rules to the stage. For example, in a room with Mama Otto lurking in the middle, shooting and defeating Evil Otto, yes he's back, will cause Mama Otto to furiously summon 4 more Evil Ottos to relentlessly pursue you. While Berzerk had some well-regarded ports to Atari 2600 and 5200 back in the day, Frenzy only had a port to the underappreciated ColecoVision console, making it much more of a cult classic than its much more well-known predecessor. If you enjoyed Berzerk though, you'll definitely get a kick out of Frenzy. Liberator is a 1982 arcade game by Atari, designed by Dennis Harper. It's based on the Atari Force comic book series from DC Comics, which began as a series of mini-comics bundled with the Atari 2600 releases of Defender, Berzerk, Star Raiders, Phoenix and Galaxian, and subsequently became its own standalone series. The Atari Force story that forms the basis of Liberator is actually just the same as the one included with the 2600 version of Phoenix, with a few elements tweaked slightly. Liberator is often described as an inversion of Atari's classic Missile Command. Instead of defending a series of static bases from incoming missiles, this time you are the one attacking the bases. The mechanics are similar to Missile Command though. Rather than shooting things directly, you instead destroy enemies and structures by catching them in the explosions from your missiles. As such, forward planning and careful timing is essential in Liberator. Liberator was not one of Atari's bigger hits, with less than 1,000 arcade cabinets making it out into the wild. It's become a more well-known cult favourite in more recent years though, and is a fun twist on the Missile Command formula for those who want to try something a little bit different. Lost Tomb is the last of the Stern Electronics games to be included on the Atari Edition Super Pocket, and was first seen in arcades in 1982. Although superficially resembling Berzerk and Frenzy, the game was designed by Dan Lee rather than Alan McNeil, and features somewhat more complex mechanics, including twin-stick gunplay, handled through a combination of directional pad and face buttons on the Super Pocket, plus treasures to collect, walls that can be destroyed using the protagonist's whip, and a non-linear progression through the game's levels. Lost Tomb reviewed well on its original release. The first Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, had released the prior year, and reviewers felt that Lost Tomb was a good adaptation of a similar adventure movie formula for arcades, though noted that the depth of the game's mechanics would likely make it inaccessible to less experienced players. Your aim in Lost Tomb is to survive each room, collecting treasure chests and defeating enemies along the way. Each room has a time limit, after which a trap will go off, making it more difficult, though not impossible, to escape. You can defeat enemies by using your gun, though it's important to keep an eye on your ammunition level, as Lost Tomb is an early example of a game with a reloading mechanic. You also have a limited number of whips that can be used to defeat enemies surrounding you, and even destroy walls. At various points, Lost Tomb will offer you a sale on whips. On the original arcade machine, you'd have to put in another coin to take advantage of these sales, but on Super Pocket you can just hit the select button to add another virtual credit, or you can challenge yourself to make it through without these bonuses. First released to arcades in 1982, Millipede was developed by Ed Logg and Mark Cherney, the latter of whom has become more well known in recent years as one of the technical minds behind the later PlayStation platforms. Millipede is the follow-up to 1981's Centipede, which was developed by Ed Logg and Donna Bailey, and features more frantic, varied gameplay than its predecessor. The basics are the same though. Progress through the levels by destroying the Millipede that gradually makes its way down from the top of the screen, contending with various other creepy crawlies that attempt to interfere with your efforts as you go. As in Centipede, your efforts are both helped and hindered by the field of mushrooms that's scattered across the screen. Some enemies drop additional mushrooms as they proceed across the screen, and each segment of Millipede you destroy also produces mushrooms. Canny players can manage the mushrooms in order to funnel the Millipede down particular routes, making it easier to defeat. But you'll need to take care, as earwigs will poison any mushrooms they touch, and if the Millipede touches a poisoned mushroom, it will immediately come charging in your direction. Millipede is a frantic, fast-action game, and a favourite of early 80s arcade enthusiasts. My mum likes this game, and you can count that as quite the accolade. Developed by Dave Toyer and released in 1980, Missile Command is the quintessential Cold War paranoia video game, reflecting global unease at the political climate between the USA and the USSR in the late 70s and early 80s, and the perceived threat of nuclear war that came with said situation. Indeed, the game's use of the end rather than game over at the conclusion of a session is intended in part to highlight how in a nuclear war there would be no winners, there would just be an end to it all. The concept of Missile Command is simple. Defend your cities from the incoming missiles. The execution was, and still is, very distinctive though. Rather than simply shooting down enemies by firing shots up the screen at them as in earlier shoot-'em-ups, in Missile Command you can only destroy incoming threats by catching them in the explosions of your own missiles. This makes accuracy and timing of absolutely critical importance, particularly as the game's pace escalates considerably in its later stages. One key thing to get used to in this arcade version of Missile Command is that you have 3 missile bases you can fire from. The central missile base fires missiles that move faster than those from the outer 2 bases, but as each base only has limited ammunition, it's best to save these shots for real emergencies and instead try to fire from the bases closest to each incoming threat. While there's no way to win Missile Command, you can at least put the end off a little longer with good performance. Reaching various score milestones repairs previously destroyed cities, and the further you progress in the game, the faster you'll earn points, up to a maximum multiplier of 6 times. It'll all come to an end soon though. Thankfully, unlike reality, in Missile Command you get to try again when the worst happens. First released in 1976 and designed by Dave Shepard, Ron Milner, Steve Mayer and Terry Fowler, Night Driver is one of the first ever first-person perspective racing games, and indeed one of the earliest first-person perspective games in general. It is believed that the game was inspired by a German arcade machine known as Nürburgring 1, or Nürburgring 1 I guess, developed by Dr. Rainer Fürst and released earlier in 1976. Night Driver's first-person perspective driving is created using simple visuals to represent glowing markers on the edge of the road, hence the nighttime setting. The player's car cockpit is not actually drawn by the arcade machine itself. Instead, it was presented as a plastic insert that sat in front of the game's monitor. This was a common technique to get around technological and graphical limitations of the period. Like many other early arcade games, there's no way to win Night Driver, so the aim is simply to top your best score. If you can score 300 points, you'll get a time extension, and if you score over 1,000 points, the score wraps back around to 0, meaning you can score 300 points again for another extend if you're good enough. Expect to put in a bit of practice before you'll be able to get that far though. Released in 1972 and developed by Alan Alcorn, Pong began its life as a training exercise, but Atari co-founders Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney were so impressed with Alcorn's work that they decided to put the game into full production. This was a wise decision, as Pong became the first commercially successful video game and played a key role in establishing the video game industry in the first place. Although widely credited to Atari, Pong wasn't the first game to offer a simple bat and ball experience for 2 players. Instead, the game is widely acknowledged to have originated on the Magnavox Odyssey, the world's first commercial home video game console, which released earlier in 1972. Indeed, Pong's resemblance to the Odyssey's table tennis game sparked a series of lawsuits by Magnavox, who had successfully patented what a judge called the pioneering patent of the video game art. Besides Atari, Magnavox also sued Coleco, Mattel, Seeburg and Activision, with the last of these lawsuits not concluding until the mid-1990s when the patents expired, with Magnavox having won or settled in every case, netting more than $100 million in the process. Pong is extremely simplistic by modern standards, but still a fun way to pass the time, making it a great handheld game. Plus, what celebration of Atari would be complete without it? Released in 1978 and developed by Owen Rubin, Skydiver is another early Atari arcade game that is simple to learn but hard to master, in a similar fashion to Canyon Bomber. The goal is simple: jump out of a plane and land accurately on a target platform. The later you leave opening your parachute, the more points you score, but if you leave it too late, you'll make a right old mess on the pavement. Skydiver's simplicity makes it a great handheld game for quick sessions. The only controls are jumping, opening your parachute, and steering your descent on the way down. You'll need to keep an eye on the wind, as indicated by the windsocks on the landing pads, to stay on target. Hailing from 1978, Super Breakout was developed by Ed Rotberg and, as the name suggests, is a follow-up to Atari's genre-defining Breakout from 2 years earlier. Its main enhancement over its predecessor is the ability to select between 3 different game modes. In double mode, you have a pair of paddles to control and begin with 2 balls in play. Cavity has 2 balls trapped in the wall which can be released for multi-ball action. And Progressive causes the wall to gradually advance down the screen as you continue playing. Super Breakout is one of several Atari games to receive an official licensed audio drama adaptation by Kid Stuff Records. The record tells the story of NASA astronaut John Stuart Chang, who encounters a rainbow barrier when returning from a routine mission, and finds that the only means of escape is to toss missiles of white light against the wall. Super Breakout is a tricky game to get to grips with due to its tiny paddle and its fast-paced gameplay. Once you get the hang of things though, this is a great handheld game to pass the time with. In Adventure, a 1980 release for Atari 2600, developed by Warren Robinett, you take on the role of an adventurer seeking to recover a magical chalice and return it to the Golden Castle. The game began life as an adaptation of the popular 1977 text adventure Colossal Cave Adventure, but became its own distinctive thing during the year it took to develop. Today, it's regarded as the origin point for action adventures and role-playing games presented from a top-down perspective. Adventure has 3 game modes, one with a small map, one with a larger map, and a third with the same larger map but randomised object locations. In all games, you'll need to use keys to open the gates on the coloured castles and outwit or defeat the fearsome dragons. In the 2 harder difficulties, you'll also have to contend with a black bat that will steal items and move them around the game world. Adventure is also home to one of the first ever Easter egg hidden features. If you know the correct actions to take, you can find a secret room in which Robinett credited himself for the game's creation. This was originally a protest at early 80s Atari's policy of not crediting game designers, but subsequently became encouraged practice as a means of rewarding player engagement and exploration. Adventure is a fun game, if a little clunky by modern standards. Once you get to grips with its basics, try your hand at speedrunning it. It's possible to beat the easy difficulty in less than 40 seconds. Can you manage it? Originally developed in 1983 but never released, Aquaventure was preserved as a prototype that was shrouded in mystery for many years. It wasn't until 2022 that Atari prototype expert Matt Reichert, working in collaboration with Atari themselves, determined that the developer behind the game was likely Gary Shannon, who also worked on the unreleased 2600 titles Miss Piggy's Wedding and Mind Race, the former of which was an adaptation of The Muppets, and the latter of which was intended to be a game based on extrasensory perception. Although never released and not even mentioned in Atari documentation from the period, Aquaventure appears to be completely finished, and it's a fun game, making it surprising that it never saw the light of day officially until the 2005 Atari Flashback 2 console. In Aquaventure, you take on the role of a deep-sea diver searching for the treasure of the legendary pilot Calico Blue. As you descend into the depths, you must avoid or destroy the marine life that gets in your way. But be careful. Every fish you defeat returns in a faster, more erratically moving form a moment later, so it's important to consider your moves carefully and only defeat the targets that are actively in your way. Aquaventure is a great handheld game. Its simple mechanics and compelling score-chasing gameplay make it one of those titles that encourage you to have just one more go into perpetuity. Originally released in 1982 on Mattel's M Network label, Dark Cavern is an adaptation of the Intellivision title Night Stalker, but actually has some significant differences from its source material. It's a simple maze-based survival game in which your aim is to score as many points as possible by defeating enemies using a weapon with limited ammunition. The main differences are that the bats from the Intellivision original have been replaced with blobs that will steal your ammunition, though the spider that paralyses you is still present. You also start with a lot more ammunition than in the television version, and each weapon pickup rewards you with an additional 10 bullets instead of 6. The scoring mechanics are a little different too. While the Intellivision version gradually introduces more powerful robots as your score increases, in Dark Cavern the value of the robots increases depending on how long you've been playing and if you can defeat multiple robots before more spawn in. When robots are purple, they're worth 1,000 points. When they're red, 2,000. When they're green, 3,000. When they're yellow, 5,000 points plus an extra life. To cause a yellow robot to appear, you'll need there to be 4 robots in the maze at once, and you'll have to defeat all 4 in rapid succession before any more arrive. Much harder than it sounds. Dark Cavern is a fun score attack game that is great to play handheld. Plus, if you want to compare and contrast to the Intellivision version, just nab yourself a copy of Intellivision Collection 1 for Evercade. In the arcades, Gravitar by Mike Halley, Rich Adam and Joe Coddington was a vector graphics title that blended together elements of Asteroids and Lunar Lander to create a notoriously challenging shoot-'em-up that supposedly even the game's own creators never saw the end of without cheating. Dan Hitchen's 1983 port to Atari 2600, while graphically simpler, kept pretty much all of the elements that made the arcade version great, but added a variety of game options to make the game a tad more accessible to those who found it more difficult. In Gravitar, your aim is to destroy all the gun emplacements on a series of planets, or destroy the enemy reactor in each solar system to immediately advance to the next. Each planet has its own distinctive landscape that you have to negotiate using a combination of asteroid-style turn and thrust movement and lunar lander-style gravity. Besides shooting the enemy emplacements, you can also use a tractor beam to pick up fuel pods that will fill your ship's tank. The landscapes become increasingly complex as you progress through the game, and after you clear 3 solar systems worth of planets, you'll have to start contending with various combinations of reversed gravity and invisible landscapes, making your job even harder than it already is. Gravitar has 5 levels of play, selectable using the select button from the title screen. Level 1, the default, is the most challenging as it only provides you with 6 lives. Level 2 gives you 15 lives. Level 3 gives you 6 lives again, but the enemy installations won't shoot at you. Level 4 gives you a whopping 100 lives, but enemy emplacements will shoot at you. And Level 5 is regarded as the beginner game. It gives you 25 lives, and it turns off the gravity element completely. Gravitar is a tough challenge and tricky to master, but it's immensely rewarding. Although graphically simple, it's a top-tier Atari 2600 game, and a great game to spend some time with on the Atari Super Pocket. Released in 1982 and developed by James Andreasen, Haunted House can be looked at as the origin point of the survival horror genre. It casts you in the role of a vulnerable player character with limited resources, and tasks you with overcoming extremely dangerous challenges, primarily through using your wits rather than violence. The basic task in Haunted House is simple: find the 3 parts of a broken urn and return them to the front door of the house. What makes life rather more difficult is that you can only see items while you have a match lit, and the house is populated by various forms of nasties according to which of the 9 difficulty levels you're playing on. You have 9 lives to expend before you're scared to death and have to try again. As well as the urn parts, you may also find a scepter, which helps fend off the enemies, and a key, which lets you open locked doors. On the harder difficulty levels, the mansion will be completely in the dark, forcing you to rely on matches to see where you're going as well as locate the important items. You can choose the difficulty level by pressing select. The easiest game is level 1 and the hardest is level 9. From game 3 onwards you'll have to deal with locked doors in the mansion, and from game 7 onwards the bat enemy will steal your items like an adventure. Game 9 is regarded as ultimate haunted house, with the maximum number of enemies at their highest level of ferocity, a unique floor plan, and plenty of locked doors to get in your way. When you think you've mastered each level, try again and see if you can make it through losing fewer lives and using fewer matches. Haunted House is easy to learn but hard to master, and the range of different difficulty levels caters to all levels of ability and confidence. A single game is pretty quick too, making it a fun handheld title to have easy access to. Radar Lock was released for Atari 2600 in 1989 and is the work of Doug Neubauer, creator of the classic Star Raiders. The game is a 3D aerial combat shoot-'em-up that uses a variation on the game engine Neubauer created for his Star Raiders sequel Solaris, which released a few years earlier. This may be one of the earliest documented instances of a game engine being reused for multiple games. Radar Lock is often looked on as Atari's answer to Sega's classic arcade game Afterburner, and indeed the two games have a lot in common gameplay-wise. Obviously, the humble 2600 has no chance of keeping up with Sega's superscalar arcade technology. Indeed, very few home systems at the time could pull off a convincing port of Afterburner. But for my money, I think Radar Lock gameplay has actually aged a little bit more elegantly than Afterburner's. As you progress through the game's missions, you'll be tasked with confronting enemy drone aircraft, then more aggressive interceptors, devious patrollers, and bombers with a fleet of escorts supporting them. You have several different weapons with which to dispatch your enemies: a machine gun, a loadout of guided missiles, and in the later scenarios, powerful proximity missiles that obliterate anything in their vicinity. So long as you can deal with the simplistic visuals, Radar Lock is a convincing, enjoyable air combat game that's fun and compelling. Its score attack gameplay makes it ideal for a repeat play, and it's the kind of game where you'll find yourself gradually improving with each new attempt. Save Mary was developed over the course of 2 years, set for release in 1990, but was never officially available until 2005's Atari Flashback 2 console, which brought a number of previously unreleased prototypes to light for the first time. It was developed by Atari veteran Todd Fry, who was at this point working for Atari founder Nolan Bushell's new company Axlon. Save Mary is a puzzle game in which you must grab blocks of concrete with a crane and drop them into a canyon without squishing the eponymous heroine, who is wandering aimlessly at the bottom of the pit. Your overall aim on each level is to use the blocks to build a tower for Mary to climb before she drowns in the rising water level. When your structure is tall enough, you can rescue her from her predicament using your crane, at which point you'll get bonus points for all the blocks you used, and then move on to a tougher challenge, often with more awkward block shapes to use. Besides the blocks, which continually come in from the sides of the screen, there are occasional power-ups to grab and drop on the shelves at the side of the canyon. A plug stops the water rising for a few seconds, a stop sign causes Mary to pause for a few moments, an oil can makes your crane move faster, a gold block makes Mary invincible to being twatted in the head with a lump of concrete, a number gives you bonus points, and a Mary figure gives you an extra life. Save Mary is a really fun game that shows the latter years of the 2600 played host to some highly creative games, and that the late 70s technology was absolutely up to realising these concepts. It's a brilliant little puzzler, quite unlike anything else in the genre, and well worth sitting down with for a lengthy session or two. Released for Atari 2600 in 1986, Solaris is Doug Neubauer's sequel to his classic Atari 8-bit game Star Raiders, and, unlike the overly ambitious 2600 port of that game, feels brilliantly suited to the 2600's simple control scheme. Your aim in Solaris is simple: track down the planet Solaris, which is hidden somewhere in a 4x4 grid of sectors, each of which are divided into grid squares. To progress through Solaris, you'll need to warp from location to location and interact with various features. Enemy fleets must be destroyed, minefields must be negotiated, allied pilots must be rescued from enemy planets. There's even trench run-esque corridor sequences. Solaris is easy to get up and running with, but there's a ton of depth to the experience. Its colourful visuals, well-crafted mechanics and involving structure make it one of the best 2600 games that was ever released, and a game still worth taking the time to get to know today. Released in 1977 and developed by Larry Kaplan, who would later produce the well-loved Kaboom for Activision, Street Racer was one of the launch titles for the Atari 2600, or the Video Computer System as it was known back then. Like most early titles for the Atari 2600, Street Racer is a simple game with a large number of variations. On the original 2600, each of these could be played with up to 4 players, but they're still fun little diversions when played solo. Most games involve avoiding obstacles, but there are a few which involve collecting items or shooting things. Game 1 is Street Racer, where you must overtake cars for points. Game 7 is Slalom, where you must pass through gates. Game 13 is Dodge 'em, which is similar to Street Racer except your aim is to successfully traverse the height of the screen repeatedly. Game 17 and 19 are Jet Shooter, a simple shoot 'em up. Game 21 is Number Cruncher, where you score points for running over numbers on the track. And Game 25 is Scoop Ball, in which you must collect balls and deposit them in a computer scooper to score points. Street Racer shows its age in its visuals, but its straightforward gameplay makes it a good handheld game with which to pass the time. Released in 1982 and developed by Matthew Hubbard, Submarine Commander has the peculiar distinction of never being released by Atari themselves back in the day. Instead, it was released exclusively under the Sears Telegames brand for the Sears Video Arcade console. This was simply US retailer Sears' rebadged version of the Atari 2600, and as such any video arcade games would quite happily work on a regular 2600. Submarine Commander is a shoot-'em-up that unfolds from a first-person perspective. Your aim is to destroy various ships that appear through your periscope by aiming at them and firing torpedoes. There's a strong emphasis on leading your shots according to how far the enemy is from you and which one of your torpedo tubes is ready to fire, and at harder difficulty levels, avoiding depth charges dropped by enemy ships, the location of which are indicated by a direction marker on your control panel. Like many 2600 games, Submarine Commander has multiple game variations that can be chosen with the select key prior to starting play. Games 1, 3, 5 and 7 are the single player variants that can be played on the Super Pocket, and each gets progressively more difficult, with more and more types of boats starting to drop depth charges on the higher difficulty levels. Submarine Commander is very easy on its default difficulty level, so it's worth cranking it up at least a level or two to enjoy a bit of a challenge. It's an interesting shoot-'em-up with some light simulation elements, and worth spending a bit of time with. Timing is everything. More a historical curiosity than anything, this Atari 2600 port of Tempest was never released back in the day, and indeed no one seems to really know who was responsible for it, or perhaps no one wants to own up to it. Either way, it's worth a glance to see a valiant and mostly failed attempt to bring a 3D vector graphics classic to Atari 2600, but your time with the Atari Super Pocket is probably best spent with any of the other 49 games. Was that polite enough? Released in 1980 and developed by Bob Smith, Video Pinball for Atari 2600 is a successor to Atari's standalone video pinball games consoles that it had released throughout the 1970s. Video Pinball is a straightforward, simple pinball game in which the aim is simply to score as many points as possible. You move the flippers with the D-pad and can nudge the ball around by holding the fire button and literally moving it around the table. Though as in real pinball, doing this excessively will cause a tilt, making you lose your ball. To get the best scores, you'll want to hit the drop targets to increase the value of the bumpers, roll over the Atari logo to increase the score multiplier and earn extra balls, and hit the special lit target that occasionally appears between the two lower bumpers. There are two game variations to play. Game 1 keeps the accumulated value of the bumpers between each ball, while Game 3 resets the bumper values when you lose the ball. You can also use the L1 button on the Super Pocket to toggle on or off extra drain holes to make the game more challenging. While the virtual table is very simple and doesn't include the sort of special features we see in modern pinball simulations, Video Pinball remains a highly addictive, compelling game, and with skill play it's possible to attain some spectacular scores. Developed by Chris Crawford, who was renowned for experimental, ambitious games in the early days of computing, Wizard is an interesting take on the deathmatch scenario. Playing as the titular wizard, your aim is to destroy an evil imp. The tricky thing is the imp is invisible most of the time, but you can track him down in a number of ways. Firstly, your shots will always point at his current position, and secondly, you'll be able to hear him approaching. Your aim in each level of Wizard is to shoot the imp repeatedly until he reaches 100 points of damage. Each subsequent level causes the imp to start with fewer points of damage already applied when the encounter starts, and of course he's trying to kill you too. Wizard was never released back in the day, but it's an interesting, enjoyable little game that shows how you can put intriguing twists on straightforward concepts. Developed by Howard Scott Warshaw and released in 1982, Yars Revenge is one of the best-known Atari 2600 games. You take on the role of the fly-like Yar and are tasked with defeating the endless forces of the Quotile. You achieve this by first destroying the energy field that protects the Quotile, and then by launching the Zulon cannon at your foe. As you fight, you'll have to contend with the Quotile's destroyer missile, which constantly homes in on your position, and the occasional swirl attacks from the Quotile itself, which launch themselves at high speed directly at you. You're protected from the destroyer missile while hiding in the colourful neutral zone that flickers across the middle of each arena. Each of Yars Revenge's game variations plays slightly differently. The default game, number 2 oddly, requires you to shoot a path through the energy shield, then either eat a shield cell or touch the Quotile to summon the Zulon cannon. By pressing select, you can choose different game variations. Game 0 is an easier version of the basic game. In Game 4, the Zorlon cannon will bounce off the shield if it hits it, and Game 6 is known as Ultimate Yars, which requires you to collect Trons via eating cells, touching the Crotale or catching a bouncing Zorlon cannon shot, then touch the left side of the screen to summon a new Zorlon cannon. Yars Revenge is simple and straightforward to understand, but the pace picks up quickly. Chasing high scores is a lot of fun, and once you've got to grips with the basic game, this one will definitely keep you coming back for more. We move now into the Atari 5200 games on the Atari Edition Super Pocket, beginning with 1985's Bounty Bob Strikes Back by Bill Hogue. This is actually a sequel to Miner 2049er, which is also on the Super Pocket, so you may want to give that one a go first, as Bounty Bob Strikes Back is a rather trickier game. Like its predecessor, Bounty Bob Strikes Back is a single-screen platform game in which your goal is to claim every section of the platforms on screen by walking over them. Hampering your efforts are some mutant monsters that can be defeated, Pac-Man style, by collecting objects to make them vulnerable, then eating them. Each level in Bounty Bob Strikes Back features an interesting gimmick to contend with, so you'll probably want to read the additional instruction sheet available from the Super Pocket website to familiarise yourself with the extra controls available. There's also one of the most in-depth options menus seen in the game from this era, allowing you to tweak the game to your liking before starting a session. Just tap the R1 button from the title screen or high score table and tinker to your heart's content. Although often overshadowed by games on more popular platforms such as the ZX Spectrum's Manic Miner, Bounty Bob Strikes Back is an all-time classic platformer from the mid-80s and well worth taking some time to master. Initially conceived as the Atari 5200's answer to Combat, the original pack-in title for the Atari 2600, 1982's Countermeasure by Leo Salinas and John Segers gradually developed into its own thing. And like many other games from the early 80s, it is, among other things, a manifestation of the collective paranoia over the Cold War and potential nuclear Armageddon. In Countermeasure, you take control of a super tank, not just a regular tank, a super tank, and your job is to prevent deadly nuclear missiles from being launched. You achieve this either by destroying all the missile silos in each stage, or by entering one of the silos and correctly guessing its 3-letter failsafe code. To do this, press the R1 button on the Super Pocket to bring up the letter pad, then type in the code using the D-pad to select a letter, and the B button to confirm. By docking with refueling stations, you can receive clues to the code, or you can simply attempt to guess it. Each of the 3 letters will only be L, E or O, presumably Leo Salinas' way of sneaking in a cheeky credit for himself. Countermeasure is an interesting curiosity in that it's a genuine Atari 5200 exclusive. It didn't even find itself ported to the closely related Atari 8-bit computers. This is likely due to how it made extensive use of the multi-button Atari 5200 controller, which allows you not only to move and fire, but also to rotate the tank's turret independently of your direction of movement by holding B and using the D-pad. Countermeasure is not a well-known game at all, but it's one of the better Atari 5200 games, and absolutely worth spending the time to get to know. Final Legacy is both one of my favourite Atari 5200 games and one of my favourites on the Atari Super Pocket in general. Released in 1985 and programmed by Chris Horseman and Dan Oliver, Final Legacy is an action strategy game that combines several different game elements to create an inventive, challenging and frantic experience. And once again, it's a reflection of the world's collective fear of the Cold War and a potential nuclear Armageddon that could have resulted in. In Final Legacy, you take command of the good ship Legacy on a quest to destroy all the enemy missile bases. To achieve this, you'll need to make use of 4 battle modes. On the navigation map, you'll maneuver the Legacy around the world map, attempting to position it for an assault on each of the missile bases. If you come under attack for enemy ships, you'll need to switch to torpedo mode to deal with them. On higher difficulty levels, you'll have to destroy intelligent ships in order to reveal some of the enemy missile bases. Once in range of an enemy base, you'll switch to the sea-to-land E-beam to destroy all the facilities of that base. And, since the enemy will inevitably launch a missile attack while you're attacking their base, you'll need to use the sea-to-air laser cannon to shoot down the missiles before they reach their target. Final Legacy unfolds in real time, which means the other game elements won't wait for you. This means on higher difficulty levels you may have to contend with fending off enemy ships and incoming missiles at the same time as attacking the enemy bases. Prioritising your targets is essential, and the game can become surprisingly stressful, though the lower difficulty levels serve as a much more gentle introduction to proceedings, so start there if you're a Final Legacy newbie. Final Legacy is one of the more substantial games on the Atari Edition Super Pocket, so make sure to set aside a bit of time to play through a full game. It's definitely a worthwhile experience though. This is one of Atari's best games that no one except me talks about, so now's the time to get to know it. Released in 1982 and developed by Bill Hogue, Miner 2049er is one of the best platform games from the early 80s, not just on Atari platforms, but full stop. Designed to be a blend between Namco's Pac-Man from 1980 and Nintendo's Donkey Kong from 1981, Miner 2049er casts you in the role of the Mountie Bounty Bob, who is in pursuit of the ruthless fur trapper Yukon Johan. To progress through each level, Bob must claim every section of floor by walking over it to colour it in, and he's hindered in his efforts by the mutants that populate the mine, along with numerous gimmicks, many of which are unique to just one level in the game. As in Pac-Man, Bob can make the enemies temporarily vulnerable to being eaten by collecting items on each screen, and this is an important method of earning points. Like most early platform games, Bob cannot fall too far without dying, so planning your route around each level is absolutely essential to avoid inadvertent mishaps. As with its successor Bounty Bob Strikes Back, these days Miner 2049er tends to get somewhat overshadowed by similar games from more popular platforms, such as the ZX Spectrum's Manic Miner. For my money, Miner 2049er is still the superior game though, and it's a definite highlight of both the Atari 5200 library and the Atari Edition Super Pocket device. Originally intended for release in 1983 but never making it out to market, Xari Arena by John Segers and Courtney Grammer is a thoroughly unusual game. Conceptually, it's quite simple, but in execution it's a chaotic, vibrantly colourful game that you'd be forgiven for finding a bit confusing on your first few attempts. In Xari Arena, your aim in each stage is to defeat all the Xaris that emerge from the middle of the screen. The Xaris shoot fireballs at your wall of blocks, and your job is to protect that wall. You can do this either by catching the fireballs with your paddle, or holding the B button to put up your magic shield, which reflects fireballs back at the Xaris. Your magic shield will automatically go up when your paddle is already holding 3 fireballs. When holding at least one fireball, you can also destroy Xaris by moving into them. If you run into a Xari while not holding any fireballs, your paddle will be temporarily stunned, leaving your wall open to attack. If things get a bit hectic, you have several fire extinguishers on hand that will sweep away troublesome fireballs. You get a new one of these in each level and they can be saved up, but it's worth using them liberally to keep your blocks as safe as possible. Xari Arena definitely takes time to get to grips with, but once you got a feel for it, there's a lot of fun to be had. Persevere if you find it a bit tricky on your first couple of attempts. There's a hidden gem waiting to be found here. First of the Atari 7800 titles to be found on the Atari Edition Super Pocket is Alien Brigade, which originally released in 1990, late in the 7800's lifespan. It was developed by Ken Grant, who would go on to contribute to a number of licensed games, including the surprisingly good Zelda-like for Game Boy and NE system, made to tie in with Robin Hood Prince of Thieves, and the somewhat less good Bart's Nightmare on Super NES Erasta Sesta. Alien Brigade is a shameless rip-off of Taito's first-person shooter Operation Wolf with a sci-fi twist. As well as defeating your common or garden military targets and trying your best not to kill the hostages, you'll also find aliens, both obvious and subtle. Success in Alien Brigade is partly dependent on learning to recognise the various tells that indicate a seemingly human character is actually an alien in disguise. Despite being designed with the light gun in mind, Alien Brigade is eminently playable as a crosshair shooter. Good job, because with the lack of light gun games out there, a lot of folks didn't bother picking one up. It's a good showcase of the Atari 7800's capabilities, and its lack thereof in the sound department, and a really solid, fun, arcade-style game. It's deja vu as we return to Asteroids, this time for my favourite home port on Atari 7800. This version was made by Greg Munster and Doug McRae from General Computer Corporation, a frequent collaborator with Atari after the pair resolved a bit of a hoo-ha over the former selling unauthorised modifications of the latter's Missile Command arcade game. Moby Games also credits someone listed only as Ethan, but I can't find any information on who this might be. Your contributions are noted and appreciated wherever and whoever you are, Ethan. Anyway, Asteroids for Atari 7800 is a well-presented, colourful take on the Atari classic with multiple difficulty modes and a strangely addictive quality I personally just never quite feel from the arcade original. There's not much more to say about it really, other than the fact it's worth playing independently of the arcade version to see how you get along with it. Another arcade conversion for the next game as we reach Centipede for Atari 7800. This was originally composed in 1984 by Dave Payne, Kevin Osborne and Seth Davis from General Computer Corporation, but didn't make it to market until the 7800 hobbled out the door far too late to make a real impact in 1986. Which is a shame because this is a really good version of Centipede, and for my money more fun to play with the joystick or D-pad than the original arcade game, which used a trackball controller. As in all other versions of Centipede, your aim is simple: destroy the Centipede repeatedly in an attempt to gain a high score. As you destroy segments of the Centipede, they'll turn into mushrooms that get in the way of both you and the enemies, and various other creepy crawlies turn up at various junctures to make your life miserable. This 7800 version of Centipede isn't really pushing the hardware super hard, but it does play really well, so be sure to spend some time with it. This next game has a somewhat convoluted story behind it, so indulge me for a moment, or skip forward a bit if you already know this one. In 1983, John Palovich and Joel Gluck released a game called Dandy for Atari 8-bit home computers via the Atari Program Exchange, an initiative similar to today's indie publishing ventures where hobbyist, non-commercial programmers would send their work to Atari to get it published and distributed. Dandy was a top-down arcade-style take on dungeon crawling for 1 to 4 players, and was a direct influence on Gauntlet, a 1985 title from Atari Games, who by this point were completely separate from Atari's consumer electronics division. Palovich sued Atari Games for Gauntlet and settled out of court. Gauntlet designer Ed Logg later admitted that Dandy had been a direct influence on Gauntlet. A year later, Atari Corporation, the consumer electronics division, released Dark Chambers, an adaptation of Dandy's formula with significant enhancements. Palovich wasn't directly involved with the development of Dark Chambers, but he did get a credit in the original manual at least. Anyway, Dark Chambers is basically a Gauntlet with the serial numbers filed off, and less desire to keep you inserting coins by virtue of it being designed specifically for home play. The 7800 version found on the Atari Edition Super Pocket is probably the best version, and well worth a play. There was a brief period in the 80s where diagonally scrolling quasi-3D shoot-em-ups were fashionable, likely prompted by the solid commercial and critical reception of Sega's Zaxxon from 1982. Desert Falcon was Atari's take on the subgenre, developed for Atari 7800 by Mike Feinstein, Bob Kukura, John Raychek, and Paul Moody from General Computer Corporation. Work on Desert Falcon originally started in 1984, but stalled when the 7800's release was delayed as a result of Atari's turmoil under Jack Trammell's new leadership. It eventually made it to market in 1987 alongside a 2600 version by Bob Polaro, and is an interesting, unusual shoot-em-up. Desert Falcon's main gimmick is the way in which you acquire power-ups by collecting sets of 3 hieroglyphics from the ground. Different combinations reward you with different bonuses, or in later levels there's also the possibility of acquiring curses too. You'll want to try and remember the most helpful combinations of hieroglyphics to make getting through the tougher stages easier, and along the way you'll want to snag plenty of treasures for bonus points too. The 7800 version of Desert Falcon is the strongest version by a significant margin. Although the 2600 version is a valiant effort, it's somewhat hobbled by the hardware it's running on. The additional graphical oomph the 7800 offers allows the game to fully realise its vision though, and the result is a solid, challenging isometric shoot-em-up. Atari made a few driving games for the arcade in the earliest days of video games, but they didn't make all that many races for home consoles. Fatal Run is one of the few examples they did, and it blends traditional vanishing point racing with post-apocalyptic vehicular combat, similar to Atari games Road Blasters from 1987. Fatal Run's 2600 and 7800 versions were released exclusively in Europe in 1990. The 7800 version was developed by Adam and David Clayton, Steve Aguirre and Paul Webb of Sculptured Software. In Fatal Run, your task is to race between towns delivering a radiation vaccine to a post-apocalyptic society suffering after a comet hit the planet. Your long-term goal is to make it through all 32 stages in the game to launch a rocket to nullify the radiation, but along the way you'll need to learn various code words, fend off enemies who want to steal the vaccines for themselves, and contend with perilous road conditions. Between each stage you'll enter a shop where you can repair your vehicle and purchase various special items to help you along your way. The better you do, the more money you'll earn to spend on repairs and weapons, so careful but aggressive driving is a must. There were better racing games around on all manner of platforms by 1990, but Fatal Run is still an interesting and perfectly playable example of Atari's take on the genre. Its emphasis on combat rather than racing makes it a distinctive game, and the 7800 version's visuals are a significant upgrade from the 2600 version, so there's plenty of long-term challenge, meaning you may well find yourself coming back to this one many months after you first try it. The Atari 7800 was extraordinarily good at arcade-style games, and this excellent port of Food Fight is one of the best examples. Developed by Keith Sawyer, Dave Brown and Rob Harris of General Computer Corporation, Food Fight is an example of how good a conversion you can end up with if you get the same people who made the arcade original to make the home port. Sadly, in what is probably a familiar refrain by this point, Food Fight for 7800 was very late to market. Despite being developed in 1984 alongside the arcade game, it eventually came out alongside the console's launch in 1986, and remains a favourite title from the 7800 library for many enthusiasts. Food Fight's concept is very simple. In each stage, all you have to do is get Charlie Chuck from the right side of the screen to the ice cream cone awaiting him on the left. Standing in your way are several nefarious chefs, however, so you'll need to pick up the items of food lying around the floor and fling them at the chefs to clear yourself a path to victory. Food Fight is super easy to learn but enormously compelling and addictive. The gradual escalation of the points you earn with each passing level makes it an immensely satisfying game to play, and its well-paced difficulty curve means it never feels unfair. Definitely a highlight of both the 7800's library and the built-in games for the Atari Edition Super Pocket. One of the Atari 7800's most notorious games due to its bizarre premise, Ninja Golf is also, thankfully, a really enjoyable title. Released in 1990 and developed by David Dent and David R. Sullivan, the concept behind Ninja Golf is simple. Having completed most of your ninja training, just one final challenge awaits: 9 holes of Ninja Golf. Ninja Golf alternates between a very simple golf interface, during which you aim your shot using an overhead map and press the button when the appropriate power level is depicted. Then you run from your starting lie to where the ball landed, beating up or avoiding ninjas and various other enemies along the way. The terrain your ball passed over determines the environments you'll have to proceed through as you attempt to reach your next shot. For example, if you shoot over a bunker, you'll have to proceed through a sandy section. Shoot over water, you'll have to spend part of your run fighting underwater. It's a gloriously silly time, but it backs up its stupid concept with some really solid but straightforward mechanics, making it a wonderful arcade-style game, a good showcase of the 7800's capabilities, and a title you'll almost certainly keep coming back to on the Atari Super Pocket. Atari had another go at the Vanishing Point Racer with Motor Psycho, which was released in 1990 and developed by Blue Sky Software. Unlike Fatal Run, Motor Psycho is a more conventional take on the racing game genre, offering 4 tracks to challenge and a score attack formula very obviously inspired by Namco's Pole Position. It's perhaps worth noting for context that the pack-in game with an Atari 7800 back in the day was an excellent port of Pole Position 2, and Motor Psycho is clearly riffing on that somewhat. There's a few twists though. Firstly, you're racing motorbikes rather than race cars, and secondly, there are stunts and obstacles around the course, allowing you the opportunity to earn additional points beyond simply travelling as far as possible before the timer expires. As with Fatal Run, there were better racing games around on other platforms in 1990, but Motorcycle is still a decent time once you get to grips with its handling. In particular, you'll want to master the art of downshifting to low gear to make it round particularly tight corners, as your bike is somewhat lacking in the brakes department. The score attack format gives Motorcycle plenty of replay value, so be sure to take a bit of time to discover its charms. It is, to paraphrase the wonderful AtariProtos.com, an excellent resource for anyone studying Atari history, the best motorcycle racing game on the Atari 7800, and indeed the only motorcycle racing game on the Atari 7800. You'll be pleased to know we're into the home straight now with a selection of games originally released for Atari's technically impressive but commercially disastrous Lynx handheld. The first of these is Basketbrawl by Blue Sky Software, a title originally developed for 7800 in 1990 but ported to Lynx 2 years later. Basketbrawl blends a basketball game with a beat 'em up, allowing you to shoot some hoops while beating 7 shades of snot out of your opponents. Victory is primarily determined by the basketball side of things, however, so however tempting it is to just wail on your opponents repeatedly, you shouldn't forget to take a few shots along the way. You should also watch out for the referee, who is more interested in a bit of his own brawling rather than actually calling any fouls. Basketbrawl is a fun little diversion that feels like it could have made a fun arcade game. It's far from the best game that came out on Lynx, but it's still an enjoyable and silly take on sports that even those who typically shy away from sports games can get a kick out of now and again, no pun intended. Not to be confused with the Spectrum game from 1982, the arcade game from 1988, the Acorn Archimedes title from 1991, or the Atari Jaguar game from 1994, Checkered Flag for Lynx was developed by Eric Ginner and Jerome Struck, with art by Susan McBride, Melody Rondo and Eric Elliott, and music by Robert Vieira. It's commonly cited as one of the very best Atari Lynx games, and with good reason. It's excellent. Checkered Flag is a Formula 1 style racing game with highly customizable options, allowing you to run anything from a solo hot lap practice session up to an 8-race championship against a pack of computer opponents, with any race having between 1 and 50 laps. You can even pick the driver's gender, which, as the original manual notes, makes no difference to your driving ability, but does have a marked impact on what occurs should you be fortunate enough to take first place in an event. Checkered Flag has a host of different tracks available, ranging from simple circuits with long, slow, lazy corners up to intricate tracks where straightaways are a rare occurrence. You can play with automatic gear shifting or a manual 4-speed or 7-speed gearbox, and it's worth mastering the manual transmissions if you want to get the very best out of the game. Checkered Flag was, at least in part, originally designed as a showcase for the Atari Lynx's smooth sprite scaling capabilities. It's much more than a tech demo though, it's a top-notch racing game and absolutely a highlight from the Atari Edition Super Pocket library. Released in 1992 and developed by Knight Technologies, Dirty Larry is of course a take on the classic movie Dirty Harry. The game unfolds as a scrolling beat-em-up in which you must take Larry through a series of levels in pursuit of the villainous Mr. Snuff. Unusual elements in Dirty Larry include how it unfolds on a single plane rather than a 2.5D style most beat-em-ups adopt, the use of projectile and thrown weapons as much as hand-to-hand combat, and the fact you only have a single life with which to clear the game, though health pickups are relatively plentiful. Dirty Larry has had a bit of a mixed reception over the years, but it's a title from the Lynx library I've always been quite fond of. It's a nice showcase of the system's graphical capabilities if nothing else, but give it a few plays and you may well find yourself compelled to try and see it through to the conclusion at least once. One of the Lynx's more notorious games, Kung Fu, was released in 1992 and developed by Law Games Limited. In it, you take on the role of a rogue scientist who has been miniaturized and forced to fight his way through his own freezer, which has become populated by mutant foodstuffs thanks to his careless storage of a dangerous secret chemical in there. Kung Fu is a straightforward take on the beat-em-up, with large chunky sprites and an appealingly silly concept. Your aim is to prevent your food from taking over the world by fighting your way from the freezer to the fridge, then the floor, then the worktop, and finally the window box. Along the way, you'll encounter a variety of enemies, and you have a decent array of moves with which to defeat them, including jabs, stronger punches, kicks, sweeps, and flying kicks. As with most beat-em-ups, you must beat your way through each enemy encounter to proceed to the next, and gradually make your way to the conclusion of each stage. Kung Fu is often treated as a bit of a joke game by a lot of people, and to be sure there are better beat-em-ups out there. It has an appealing, silly concept though, and it's not unplayable by any means. Be sure to give it a go, and while doing so, ponder why the poor old Lynx might have been a bit of a commercial flop over the long term. It's truly a mystery. '90s Robo-Squash, developed by Ed Schneider with art by Robert Nagel and music by David Timinaro, is a fun little Lynx game that takes the basic concept of Pong, adds some additional features, and places the whole thing in 3D, making it a fun showcase of the Lynx's hardware sprite scaling feature. In the grand tradition of classic Atari games that date right back to the earliest 2600 releases, it also has an absolutely ludicrous sci-fi story to justify its own existence. But all you really need to know is that this is 3D Pong Plus, and it's quite a bit of fun. In Robo-Squash, you compete against a computer-controlled opponent in an attempt to capture territory on a game board. You capture a square by winning a round of Robo-Squash, either by getting 3 balls past your opponent, or by hitting a mechanical spider that appears when all the bricks in the centre of the arena are destroyed. To make things more interesting, there's a number of special items available which you can use by hitting the ball into them. These include a dragon that lets you shoot fireballs, a mouth that lets you catch the ball instead of hitting it, an expander that makes your paddle larger, and a spotter that shows you where the ball is going to end up on its current trajectory. Robo-Squash is about more than simply winning the rounds of Robo-Squash. You also earn a score via various means, including hitting bricks and special items, and capturing vertical and horizontal rows of territories on the main game board. Robo-Squash's unusual perspective makes it a fun twist on one of the oldest styles of video game there is. It's a fun and oft-forgotten part of the Lynx's library, and worth spending the time to get to know. Every self-respecting 80s and 90s gaming platform needs a good platformer, and Scrapyard Dog, developed by Creative Software Designs, was one of the better ones on Lynx. Placing you in the role of a young boy named Louis who is trying to rescue his kidnapped dog, Scrapyard Dog is a colourful, varied platformer that is absolutely packed with secrets to discover. As you progress through Scrapyard Dog, you'll have to avoid obstacles, defeat enemies with various weapons, starting with nothing more than tin cans you toss out in front of you but escalating to flamethrowers and lasers later in the game, and acquire power-ups. By ducking into secret areas, you can earn bonus points and special items, but your main aim is to progress from left to right in each stage, keeping Louis safe along the way. Scrapyard Dog is ostensibly a port of an Atari 7800 title from the prior year, but in practice the two games are different enough from one another that they're best considered to be different products with the same basic concept. This Lynx version is a solid, enjoyable platformer with a pleasingly relaxed pace, but plenty of challenge. There's a lot to keep you busy here over the long term. It's 2 for the price of 1 in this 1995 title, which was the last officially released title for the Lynx back in its heyday. As the name suggests, it offers souped up versions of 2 of Atari's all-time arcade classics, featuring brand new graphics and sound, plus added depth to the gameplay. It was developed by Steve Marshner, with graphic contributions by Heidi Wendling. Johann Sebastian Bach gets the credit for the music, but I'm not sure he's aware of that fact. Attempting to update a retro classic with too many additional features can sometimes result in a game that's inferior to its source material, but both Super Asteroids and Super Missile Command strike an excellent balance between being respectful to their inspirations and adding more modern, for 1995 anyway, innovations. In Super Asteroids, for example, you can collect power-ups for additional firepower, and your ship can survive multiple collisions. In Super Missile Command, meanwhile, you earn money throughout each stage, which can be spent on new special weapons, most of which involve different explosion patterns to your regular missiles. Of the two, Super Missile Command is my personal favourite by a significant margin, but Super Asteroids is still a good take on Asteroids. I'm just not all that fond of Asteroids personally, so your mileage may vary. Here's a game I've been hoping would make a comeback for years, as it was by far my favourite game on the Lynx back when I had one all those years ago. Turbo Sub was first released in 1991 and developed by Ed Schneider, with graphics by Rob Mariani and music by Matt Scott. It's a first-person 3D shoot-'em-up that some people liken to Sega's Space Harrier, but it has enough distinguishing features to make it stand out as its own thing. In Turbo Sub, you take control of a futuristic sub that can also fly. On each stage you begin above the water and must fend off waves of enemies while avoiding their attacks. Once you've defeated enough enemies, you'll be given the signal to dive, at which point the second part of each level will begin. This generally involves a combination of obstacles to avoid and enemies to defeat, and concludes with a docking sequence, after which you can spend accumulated money on power-ups for the next stage. Turbo Sub is a great game, and I'm thrilled to have it on a handheld again. I played hours of this back when I had a Lynx, and I suspect I'm going to be playing it again a whole lot more on the Atari Edition Super Pocket. And finally, we come to a game that regularly ranks highly in lists of the best Lynx games. It's 1991's Warbirds, designed and programmed by Rob Zadibble, with art by Susan McBride and Melody Rondo, and music by Robert Vieira. This is a World War I flight sim focused entirely on dogfighting. Like its stablemate Checkered Flag, it's a highly customizable game, allowing you to play it as anything from an arcade-style flight game with a simplified flight model, infinite ammo and total invincibility, to a challenging simulation with more realistic physics, limited ammunition, and a plane that can't take very much punishment at all. Warbirds lacks full takeoff and landing sequences, but is otherwise a surprisingly solid flight sim, particularly considering it's designed for a platform with 4 buttons rather than a full keyboard. You can look around in all directions, pull off genuine aerobatic manoeuvres such as the Immelmann turn and split S, and the use of scaling sprites for both the cloud cover and enemy planes gives it a much more convincing look than the early polygons found in other flight sims of the era. Warbird's only real weakness is that it lacks any sort of structured campaign or missions more complex than shoot down between 1 and 3 enemy planes, instead simply challenging you to survive for as many missions as you can without dying. That makes it eminently suitable for handheld play though, and it's a pleasure to revisit this classic on a modern device. And so that's that. 50 classic games from Atari and Stern, covering several generations of gaming hardware, from the earliest days of the arcades and the primitive visuals of the 2600 up to the impressive capabilities of the 16-bit Lynx. Atari games will always have a special place in my heart given that I grew up with them, and I'm honoured to have played a part in bringing this collection of them to market. My Atari Edition Super Pocket is likely going to become my de facto portable gaming device for a long time to come, and like I said in the intro, I'm pretty sure that will be the case regardless of whether or not I worked for Blaze. I hope you've enjoyed this quick look at all 50 games. It just remains for me to say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.